Okay, so while we're swapping places here for the safety and industrial hygiene pillar, let me tell you about our next two panelists, Rick Pollock and Dan Anna. Rick Pollock is a CSP, and he is an experienced safety professional specializing in performance improvement, educational technology, and management systems. He is a certified safety professional, degreed in safety from the University of Wisconsin, Whitewater, and is the president of CLMI Safety Training. Rick has broad safety management experience working in industries as varied as heavy manufacturing, petrochemical, consumer goods, biomedical device manufacturing, and insurance. And as the founder of CLMI Safety Training, he has produced more than 500 education courses that are used worldwide. He currently serves on 2 university advisory boards, including the School of Public Health and the NIOSH-funded Educational Resource Center at the University of Minnesota and the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater Department of Environmental and Safety Studies. Rick has been a member of ASSE for 39 years and served as the Society's 98th president. He has received several ASSE awards, including the Charles E. Culbertson Award for creating member educational opportunities, the President's Award for funding educational expansion, and the Northwest Chapter Safety Professional of the Year Award for his significant organizational contributions. Please join me in welcoming Rick Pollock. Our second panelist, Dr. Daniel Anna, is a CIH and a CSP, and he's a senior industrial hygienist and assistant group supervisor at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory in Laurel, Maryland. Dan is a certified industrial hygienist and a safety professional with a background in comprehensive industrial hygiene and safety areas, including risk and exposure assessment and control, ergonomics, and system safety. Prior to joining APL, he spent nearly 15 years at Millersville University, where he was a professor and program coordinator in the Occupational Safety and Environmental Health program. In addition, he has worked as an industrial hygienist in the petrochemical industry and as an independent consultant. Dan received a Bachelor of Science in Safety Science from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, a Master of Science in Industrial Hygiene from Texas A&M University, and received his PhD in Industrial Health from the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Anna. Gentlemen, thank you this afternoon. I know that we're going to have some interesting questions here. For over 30 years, safety and industrial hygiene programs have crosswalked with hazardous materials managers. How can we further align those partnerships toward greater sustainability and compliance?
Okay. Actually, I'm not sure that we're still crosswalking. I think we're now walking together. And I think that's an important part as we move forward, is that we're starting to see more people dabbling in each of the areas. And just like we heard with the discussions of the environmental area, the discussions of safety, industrial hygiene, we're all having some responsibilities to do all of those things. So I think as we move forward, we're going to see that maybe people who may consider themselves an industrial hygienist or a safety professional or environmentalist are going to start looking for, how do I show that I have competency in some of those other areas? And I think that's where things like credentialing and certifications will come into play.
So not just having one specialty, but maybe 2 or 3, and interdisciplinary type collaboration.
I think you'll see that, and you see that in the change in the workplace with number of people on staff.
You know, and I agree, Dan. I see a great deal of, I'll call it inbreeding, where we all are having to know a good deal about what each other does. At the University of Minnesota, well over 25 years ago, they started something called the Team Approach to Occupational Health and Safety. It did not include hazardous material managers or the environmental side when it began, but it was done in such a way so the industrial hygienists, occupational health physicians, safety professionals and health nurses could begin to talk to each other and understand more about the perspective that the individual would take or the professional would take in dealing with a problem. I'm glad to say now that that's been expanded, and we, in fact, our ASSE chapter just had a boat outing with the AHMP and IHMM group.
Wow.
And took the time to be social together, to get to know each other. So I think understanding what we do and beginning to work together is something, it's not a question of how we do it, it's let's continue doing it.
Well, in that regard, do you think there's a difference in the way those relationships evolve as a company goes from being small to a larger company, or maybe going or diversifying? How do you see that in the safety and industrial hygiene? Because from an environmental standpoint, as companies become larger, they go from having an EH person who kind of has to know everything to staff that then become specialists. So from a safety and industrial hygiene standpoint, how do you all see that?
You know, I think you're still seeing staffs that get smaller, and it's on a relative scale. So a large company may have more than one person there, but they're still going to have so few people that they're going to have to dabble in each of those areas. I mean, I can draw back when I started in the petrochemical industry. I was the industrial hygienist, we had the safety person, we had person who would do the groundwater, we had a person who did the solid waste, we had one who did the hazardous waste. So we had somebody doing everything, and in that same facility today you might have 2 people, and they're going to share some of those responsibilities, and certainly there'll be some expertise that somebody will have in one area over another, but competency in those other areas is essential.
And it's an opportunity for those professionals to get to learn from each other and then become better than the two of them separately. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would. You know, 2 things came to mind. I think that the smaller the organization is, the more they tend to be unconsciously incompetent. They don't know what they don't know. And as more professional management joins the firm or whatever the organization is, that more global perspective or more experienced perspective is added in. You know, the other is that as companies grow, let's look at you know, the waste business itself, not the hazardous waste, but the waste business. I was just with some folks with Republic Services and hearing their story of understanding the roll-ups that occur in various industries. And you take regional or smaller businesses that were those unconsciously incompetents, and now all of a sudden they're part of a very larger organization. And you have an organization that had really very few people in environmental health and safety now have staff that is, you know, area-based or regional-based that can provide a much higher level of support.
So one example would be like a tool manufacturer being taken over by some worldwide company,
Right.
and the small regional or locally based company, you know, maybe had one person in facilities who handled all of their.
Well, you know, and I've heard stories about smaller organizations that you know, you look at just simply identifying your waste stream and making sure that you're segregating properly and you're labeling properly. And it's like, how can you possibly even run a business today with not knowing that? But there are a lot of smaller businesses that don't.
That's
you
true.
see that with your work, I'm sure.
That's true. There's also the situation where you have a company that, say, is maybe medium-sized or sometimes even large, and they haven't had a whole lot of health and safety issues or concerns, or maybe they have and they haven't been able to get their track record better to reduce their EMR or something. But they've been, you know, kind of status quo. Now all of a sudden the company management changes, and the people in the facility that have had the quote-unquote good old boy mentality of health and safety now have a CEO who came from another company that was used to having people on board in compliance and, you know, on the program. So how does that dynamic work? Have you all seen that sort of thing happen?
I'd say, first of all, it scares the living daylights out of some folks, I'm sure. I know an organization that had been really more of a food cooperative that over the years has gotten very much into energy, oil and gas, energy, refining, et cetera. And just recently hired a new CEO from a much larger company. And I was brought in, I'm a trainer, and trying to talk through how do we bring their supervisory and middle management knowledge base up far enough to understand the concepts of prevention through design as it would relate to health and safety. And it might seem that I would be talking negatively about that group. I'm not. Again, it's just a part of people you're dealing with who don't know what they don't know yet. And how do you bring them up? Because he put a very, very short timeline on the turnaround of this company's focus on environmental issues and health and safety issues.
So he was there to kick butt and take names.
Absolutely, and that's what I said. It scared the living daylights out of him.
Wow, wow, okay. Hopefully we'll get some questions on that in a little while. So let's move on to our next question. Over the past 30 years, safety and industrial hygiene programs well, no, that's the one I just read you. Sorry about that. Over the past 30 years, 30 years ago, an explosion happened that was caused by ammonium nitrate, and it leveled a whole town. And it happened again in 2013 in West Texas. Okay, one of the terms that's been thrown out to discuss this is risk and risk assessment. How would you all define risk and risk assessment? And how would you say these definitions have changed during the past 30 years?
Okay. I guess on the base level, to some degree, the definition really hasn't changed, where we're looking at probability and severity in some way of calling that. I think what has changed is we understand what the severity is a little bit better, we understand probabilities of events a little bit better, and we can do a better job of assessing, really, is this something that could happen? What would the outcome actually be? How do we manage that a little bit better? And I think we have a better understanding from a system safety perspective of how do we adjust our controls to either reduce the probability or the severity so that we can manage that a little bit better.
And would you like to add to that?
We know the hazards of ammonium nitrate, particularly in large quantities, and we know what's going to bring about ignition or the like. My way of looking at that initially was after the West explosion. There was a question of what regulations do we need that aren't in place, or what wasn't being enforced, or who is culpable, et cetera, of course, all important questions. But I think the bigger question is, from a Homeland Security standpoint, my God, how did that much ammonium nitrate find itself to be in one place? Unprotected, uncontrolled the way that it was. And the other is, from a management standpoint, you were running a business not understanding the depth of hazard and risk you were taking by running that business that way. To me, that was true, and I know it's Texas and some folks are here from Texas, but that's Wild West thinking. And in my world, it's untenable.
So from the aspect of defining risk and risk assessment, how would you frame that to to come up with either a better definition of risk or risk assessment in that regard, so that people clearly understand what their obligations are? Let
me start this one, Dan, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I listening closely to what John was saying, I think that a business owner, a business executive, a shareholder, the people that have the purse strings want to know about what can we do in this organization to sustain its profitability, to build it, to allow it to grow, to have the funds necessary. And being able to develop an ROI on risk intervention is the way that I believe we need to do it, and I'm in complete agreement. Within the safety profession, we've not done a good job of that. We've identified risk from the standpoint of risk of loss to human, property, environment, et cetera, which is correct. What we've not done is create the bridge to the inability then of the organization to reach its organizational goals and objectives and profitability targets, thus its stock price and whatever else that might be.
So in other words, we've got plenty of statistical data to manipulate and to analyze, and we may not be fully utilizing it from a business standpoint. Yeah. We're attacking the statistics and the root causes of the statistics, but we're not stepping back and looking at the integration of those things into a more holistic management business.
There's a couple of things that brings to mind. One is just the idea of risk communication. Are we doing a good job describing what those statistics mean to the decision makers? And the second, to maybe fill out a little bit on that idea of definition of risk, I think what Rick said just kind of triggered the thought that we all maybe have a slightly different definition of risk, whether we're coming from industrial hygiene or safety or environmental. And I think over the past 10 years or so, we've started to realize that we're all right, and we all have a piece of the bigger picture of what risk is. And I think the successful companies are now looking at it and saying, that's a part of the overall business risk. How does that fold into when we look at our cost and our staffing and our business reputation and our liability, and when we make decisions on what we do as a business, do we look at all of those things and roll them together before we make that business decision? And that's where trying to determine what the return on that investment is and whether or not it's a good business decision overall for whatever it is we choose to do.
Well, yeah, I think that ties in very well with what John was saying. So, and when you look at that from an environmental standpoint and from a safety and industrial hygiene standpoint, like you all said, the definitions, even though they're slightly different, the business concerns wind up being the same overall. And so it just becomes more important that these things are taken into consideration before you go and build that new plant, before you go and acquire some other company.
And it's trying to tie in overall productivity. If an employee is unable to work, or a group of employees, let's say, or a building is burned, or a major release has occurred where you're shut down, being able to make sure on the front end people understand what that cost is. And it's not just, it is negatively to the community and to the employees involved, clearly, but beyond that, it could be to the overall viability of the organization.
Yes, that definitely makes sense. So with regard to looking ahead and integrating these things into business planning, we also do have situations where we want to learn from our mistakes, okay? So we do still have to have some level of forensic analysis, if you will, to learn from our mistakes. If we use the West Texas fertilizer explosion and the other ammonium nitrate explosion that happened 30 years ago as an example, how can we draw from those events to try to prevent them from happening again, or maybe do better root cause or forensic analyses so that we can truly learn from the mistakes that happen to reduce that risk and to do better risk assessment?
In the airline industry, a crash simply cannot occur. Similarly, in an ammonium nitrate plant or storage area, an explosion simply cannot occur. Well, within the airline industry, they have a no-fault reporting system. If a pilot is exposed to a situation, whether he or she was the source or someone else, it's reported, it's discussed. It's done in a no-fault way. One of the problems that we have, whether it's environmental or OSHA or any of the other regulations, is there is fault, and there is culpability, and there is this follow-up. Somehow, if we can work towards understanding that error will occur, and if we don't take the penalty away from getting truly to the root cause, because it might not be what the person did, or even anything surrounding that person or that given situation. Yeah. It's the context in which it occurred. And as Deming said many years ago, management owns that context, not the person. And so it's very important that we get to the design aspects of things.
I think we're seeing some advances with some of the forensic work that the Chemical Safety Board does, especially for some of the chemical plant and bigger things. If the things that we learn from how they approach that and some of the educational materials that they put out after the fact, if that can work its way down into smaller companies and professionals to start thinking and approaching incidents in their own facilities with that type of critical analysis after the fact, that might be the step in the direction that we need.
What would you think would be a good way to do that?
Well, the model, I was just, thanks.
Yeah.
The model that I really liked was, the recent adoption of the SIMS for offshore drilling, which is a risk assessment approach, multi-agency, organizational, industry way of working together to identify, based on incident investigations and other feedback based on severity of loss, what is happening and what can we learn from that and what should be done about it. So I think working together to share information, if we can, is one very good way.
Well, I think that some companies really do struggle with this because they have what they might consider to be a kind of a stupid accident. Somebody slips on water that's on a mat and is otherwise has a perfect safety record or something like that, but there was a hole in the roof, and because the roof has got leaks and stuff in it, and this person, and it's clearly an accident. And what you said about management owning the environment or the context, it seems to me that that's a perfect example. But how do you go about doing a forensic analysis on something like that when obviously you can patch the hole in the roof, or maybe you're in a situation where you got to find some capital to patch the roof, but you don't want your people slipping, and you do what you can, but sometimes there are accidents that occur that you're scratching your head wondering how it can happen. So how to do your forensic analysis and to really get something out of it when you do these root cause investigations is something that, if somebody could come up with a better way to do this, it would really help us all a lot. Don't you agree?
Yeah, there's a system out there called HFACS, Human Factors Analysis Classification System. Airline industry uses it. It's used by a number of other industries, and it takes the James Reason model of what was the unsafe act or violation. What were the preconditions of the person, if you can find those? Right. What was the supervisory or management error, if any, indecision, incorrect direction, et cetera? And above that, the organizational influences, the resources, the climate of the organization, and priorities and strategy going forward. It's a great system. I love it. I teach it. The problem is trying to implement it. It's so big. And
sounds like you collect a lot of data.
It's a lot of data, and you need to know what to do with it. And one of the realities of root cause is that there never is one cause. And trying to do that gets you a linear path from here to there, and that might not be what happened.
Oh, that's a very
and we do that all the
point.
time,
Wow.
I know, in employee incidents.
Wow.
I think what you really need is just good cooperation and collaboration with your employees and with your management, so that when something does occur, you're all willing to sit down and talk about it and try to figure out what's the best way to try to prevent it from
And to
happening.
do it truthfully, and to not
Right.
feel that there's going to be repercussions,
Right.
and so that you can be truthful. Well, this leads me right up into our next question here. Many companies continue to struggle to balance rewards and consequences in their safety programs to reduce reportable injury accidents and to improve attitudes about safety. What do you believe are the crucial behavioral points and employee roles that must be addressed to improve a company's safety record and to establish a good safety culture? It's like the $52 million question.
I'm going
You're
to
like,
let
you
Rick
go
start
first
that
on
one.
Okay, Rick.
Well, let's see.
Where should I begin?
Well, people need to know what's expected. So obviously the training and the education elements are important. But beyond that, does what they're being trained and taught to do, is what they're being trained and taught to do allowed to actually occur in the workplace? Or are there competing interests? And in some cases there are. I work with the delivery industry, and often people they're scratching their head about why somebody is driving too fast or tailgating or the like, not realizing that everything is scheduled, and if I'm not at a dock by a certain time, I'm now behind for my entire day because I now lost my spot and I have to wait. And so it's the design of the work that they're working in that doesn't allow them to, it does, okay, but not really, because my boss said no more overtime this month. We're going to meet all of our schedules. I don't want to hear from one dock manager that okay, you get the story there.
Yeah.
It's how people work together. Are they allowed to use that information going forward? And the other is, what are we measuring, and what are we incenting? And I think at the end of the day, are we incenting this environment that you were talking about, where you collaborate?
Right. I think just to add to that is that you're setting, somebody wants to do their job. They want to get their check at the end of the week, and they want to meet that expectation that you set that they're going to do their job. So you've told them what you expect. Have you also set up their work environment so that they can get it done in the way that you want them to do it,
Right.
rather than just them being able to do it?
Exactly, yeah. And you know, I have to add that sometimes the compelling reasons can be things that are not necessarily job related. I've got to get this done by the end of my shift, and something unexpected happened, but I still have it in my mind that I have to get this done today, or my kid's sick and I've got to go take him to the doctor or something like that. And sometimes those compelling reasons that don't directly have to do with work can be some of the root causes and stuff. And how do we incorporate that and kind of get a handle on
I guarantee you that employee that slipped in the water because of the hole in
Yeah.
the roof didn't see it. I guarantee you that.
Yeah.
Why not? You're walking along, there it is, it's right in front of you. I don't know. Because their mind's not there. It's not a negative, it's a reality. We're thinking, what's the next thing we're doing? What are we supposed to be doing next? I just said that twice, way to go. Or some other factor, which could be a home factor, a family factor, or whatever.
That's right. Well, in that regard then, you're trying to get a handle on all these things and say that you recognize that you don't really have a really good safety culture. You want to, and you can get buy-in from certain levels of management or certain levels of line workers or employees. Who do you see as being the crucial role, the pivot role out in the factory or out in the facility that could turn the corner for a company to get them on their way to having a really, truly good mindset safety culture?
Go for it.
I guess the one-word answer, maybe it's more than one word, I can't count very well, it's going to come from the top. There has to be a message from the top of the company saying that at the end of all of this, although we expect you to do a job, we expect you to do it safely, we expect you to protect your health and the health of others around you and the environment, and there has to be that message from the top that ties in with the business that's there.
Yeah.
Not that it's more important, but that it's part of the business.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, when that message is clear and it's believable, okay, that supervisor begins to have a conversation with that employee about why they're not following a procedure that they'd been trained in. And there can be an understanding, well, the procedure has a flaw in it, and this is the flaw. And I think if we did it this way, it would be safer, and I could get the job done better. When that conversation occurs, safety improves, productivity improves, senior leadership finally gets a culture that they want.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying that you agree to some extent it's the top management, but I'm hearing that you're also thinking the first line manager or first line supervisor being a critical role.
They
there,
are,
too.
absolutely, but I agree with Dan 100% that it's...
So the message has got to come from the top.
It's got to.
But then out
Yeah.
out in the field, so to speak,
Right.
your first line supervisors and managers are really the ones
It's
who
where
make it happen.
It has to be
where
believed
coaching-
at the bottom.
Believed at
It's
the
where
bottom.
coaching
Wow.
occurs. It's where validation of the training occurs and better learning of technique and procedure. It's where teams are built. All those things that get you the culture you need to be able to move this forward.
Okay, well then, in that regard, how do you think that safety awareness and the degree of hazards faced by workers with, talking about expectations and things like that, how do you think that awareness and the degree of hazards that are faced by workers have changed over the last 30 years?
Dan, you go with that one.
Well, there's certainly a lot more information available for workers and people in general. So there's a if you're working with a chemical, you can readily and easily get information about that chemical more so today, whether you're on the job or
Yeah,
at home,
that's true.
looking it up than you ever had before. So I think there's the opportunity for workers to understand and recognize what some of the hazards are in the workplace more so than before. Whether or not they believe them or whether or not they tie that into how they do their job, I'm not sure. But I certainly think the information is more available than ever.
I think the We've learned a lot since HASCOM, inception back in 86, 84 in some states, which coincides with 30 years, which coincides with a lot of things. Having material safety data sheets available is one thing. Having things labeled properly is another. Having the education system and all of that in place is another altogether. In talking with many employers this time around with GHS and the training, they didn't spend anywhere near as much time on HASCOM training as they did first time around, because first time around they were dealing actually with the hazards of the materials. What that means to me is that we've taken this leap where the employers have built into their training already the hazards of the materials, and now we need to teach you the labeling system and the new SDS system.
Wow. Well, how do you think that technology is going to drive that awareness and, maybe foster the level of the level of safety culture awareness and buy-in?
I'd like to let Dan answer this, but in the last 2 years, our business has gone from 20% web-based training to 80% web-based training.
Wow.
It's almost like a switch was turned.
Wow.
And it scares the living daylights out of me. Okay? Not from a business standpoint, but I don't necessarily believe it's the best way to train your employees or your supervisors. Because at the end of the day, you're imparting information and knowledge, hopefully, but you're not validating it back at the work site. And I would ask each one of you to really look at, if you're going to use web-based training, how do you actually bring it to life then when the person goes back to work?
Wow. Interesting. Let's go to a web-based question to see if we can get some follow-up questions on that.
This is a question from Ali C. on the webcast. Do you expect that ISO's decision to turn the OSHA 18001 standard into ISO 45001 due in 2016 will lead to a much greater adoption of the standard by companies both in the U.S. and abroad?
You want to start with that one?
Well, I think that I'm going to do a little right turn here. There was discussion of creating an ISO standard, I believe, more than 15 years ago. Yeah. And American Society of Safety Engineers didn't want to have anything to do with it. They weren't going to be a part of it, and they didn't put anybody on the tag. This time around, they're leading it. So from that standpoint, I think there's been an awakening in the employee safety side of things, right, that management systems are far better than command and control regulatory systems. So I think that it will create an environment where there's greater adoption of management systems that are normal in other parts of the world.
I would agree with that. I think we've seen the adoption of some management systems already, and I think as it grows into the ISO world, I think you'll start to see more pull toward that. Yeah. And I think you've seen ASSE leading that tag in the US, but you also see representatives from the industrial hygiene, from AIHA there, to try to recognize that it really is a more holistic approach toward safety and health.
Wow. Okay. And how do you see that as being either, is it mostly a volunteer movement that's caused that, or has it been regulatory driven, or somebody somewhere, the light bulb went on? How do you think that change in feeling has come about?
I don't know, to be honest with you.
Really?
I can only guess. I don't know. I mean, I could comment on it, but it would be conjecture.
I think in some ways it's speculation from me too.
Yes.
I think some of the recognition that we need to do better on certain aspects of safety and health may drive some of it. Maybe some gaps in the regulations have driven some of it. I'd like to think that maybe it's some recognition that it really is good business to do it that way, is driving some of it, or maybe it's all of those. Well,
I think at the end of the day, it's risk-based versus, and management system-oriented versus command and control. And I think anybody who runs an overall corporate program of EH&S, NS, understands that you must have a good management system to be able to maintain the various internal policies and requirements that you have, much less comply with external. And so I think the better the organization is, the more likely they already have managed through systems. Right. What we need to do now is understand that these other types of systems are not necessarily foreign. It's just another thing we're going to want to make sure that we audit for, that we manage for, that we have policies, and et cetera.
Okay. Next question. You have a question from our audience or on the web?
I'm a CHMM, and I'm also a CIH, and I've been in this EH&S arena for over 35 years. The one thing that concerns me about incidents that cause mass destruction and loss of life, such as what happened in West Texas, just south of where I live in Dallas, Texas, is not so much that we already have laws and regulations on the books that coulda, woulda, shoulda maybe prevented this from happening, but what I see as a problem and no solution for it is one of attitude. What happened in West Texas was the fact that the people that owned the fertilizer plant chose not to be educated or even interested in complying with any of these regulations. And half of my career spent in consulting, I ran into this situation time and time again, especially with family-owned chemical companies, a lot like the fertilizer plant that blew up, is that they couldn't be bothered. It's all that regulatory stuff, that doesn't apply to us. That applies to the big oil refinery down the road. And it's what can we do in the future to change this attitude among businesses that have the capability to cause as much or worse destruction as to what happened in West Texas? This really concerns me.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
That's a heck of a question.
Wow.
I think.
Yeah.
You see,
Yeah.
This is why Rick threw it to me first.
Yeah.
I think you have seen. I'm going to try to paint the positive side of it and say that over the past 30 years, you have seen more places recognize that they should comply or go beyond compliance. And I'd like to say that the number of places, those small family-owned, those places that are ignoring the regulatory world or common sense, that those are becoming fewer and fewer. They're still out there. There's no doubt about that. I think from, how do we improve on that in the future? I think we need to continue to bring new folks into these professions. I think we need to continue to move away from being just compliance driven and again, integrate back into the business side of it. And why does it make sense for a company to do these things? What's the positive return on investing in our people and our environment and our equipment? So I think that we are taking the steps in the right direction. We're not there yet, but I think there's some wonderful opportunities here for people to come into this profession and continue to make it better in a lot of those workplaces.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question from our audience. Will, got two.
Mark Baumgartner over here at Cleveland. A little bit of a 90-degree question. In the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, what do you think the definition of hazardous or toxic might be? It seems to me we set that because somebody got hurt, somebody got killed, and our standards are retroactive to that. Will we ever have a standard for hazardous or toxic that's proactive, either by computer modeling or by some sort of testing, where chemicals are mandatorily tested or processes are mandatorily tested before they go into commercial use? What do you see the future there?
Well, Dan is doing this at Johns Hopkins now, so I'll
Wow.
let you talk.
Wow.
I'm not sure you're going to see that definition change. What you might see, and hopefully would see, is the way that we interpret that and the way that we apply that definition to controls. So we may not have changed how we define what that toxic level is, but we might decide that we're going to put a control in place that gets us well below that point. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question quite the way you intended it or not.
Well, you know, and part of it comes down to the risk assessment and who's going to define acceptable risk. And I think it's going to end up being senior management, the shareholders of the company, saying what is that one event or that one situation, or whether it's a fatality or an explosion, that's it. And then you get the organization looking at itself in greater detail to try to identify that beforehand.
If I may interject a little to continue the discussion on this point, on the environmental side, and it does also relate to safety as it for the public, is the European Union's REACH program for how hazards are classified, and even what sort of packaging, how you can use these in different types of products, and the different classes of products that can incorporate a toxic material going from industrial all the way towards consumer goods.
Actually, that might be one other thing that drives it, is we're seeing more focus on how the word sustainability applies to products downstream.
Yeah.
And what it means for consumer and consumer goods. So that may drive that degree of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in terms of level of risk.
And the REACH program includes that cascading notification requirement in there, all the way from the manufacturer down to the supplier, down to the distributor, and then to the local vendor of materials. And it's, you know, and it was implemented in European countries, I think, at least a year or two before the U.S. adopted it.
Right.
Now.
Right.
Okay. Very interesting question.
Yeah, good question.
Next question. I think we had a question right here.
I just had a quick question. I keyed on your comment about being unconsciously unaware. I took a course in college, and I thought I'd never use those 4 levels of consciousness, but and it didn't dawn on me until I started actually teaching and learning about hazardous materials and training people how to stay safe, that you really have to make people aware. Because if you can't make them aware, if you don't enlighten their consciousness about that, they can't change their attitude and they won't change their perception. If you don't change their perception, you won't change their idea of what risk is, because risk is all perception based. So my question to you, one of the things that I've seen, I actually have to be honest, I'm not by training a safety or industrial hygienist or anything like that. My sister is, so I'm familiar with it. But I come out of emergency management as a background. And the thing that's driving there, as well as what I've seen now doing training in EHS, is that there's such an interdisciplinary focus that we're becoming jack of trades but master of none, especially in smaller or mid-sized companies. And that for someone that has a family that owns a very small business that has said the exact same thing, I'm too small, yeah, I know about those things, but I've got too many other things, my margin's too small, how do I do that? How do you guys suggest trying to tackle that challenge as we become more interdisciplinary and try to make sure that we don't become, you know, jack of all trades or Jill of all trade, but lose the focus on mastering those key concepts to keep people safe?
I'll give a short answer and then turn it over.
Go ahead.
Just real quickly, I think for the smaller companies, more and more smaller companies rely on their insurance company loss control people.
Yeah.
And I think both AIHA and ASSC, the bigger conferences, have really focused on interdisciplinary education. A lot more safety at IH than ever before, a lot more IH environment at safety than ever before. And I think that's probably one of the focus, because that's the large body of people that can get to that group of people. So.
And I guess I would just add to that continuing education, the movement toward certifications, all of those are steps that an individual can take to help show their competency in each of those areas. And depending on which area you need to spend more time in might be where you want to demonstrate that competency the most.
And as a final note, I'll add too that more and more professional and trade industry organizations are having environmental health and safety specialists on their staff to be information resources for small businesses particularly, and this is Small Business Administration of both OSHA and EPA. Well, I think that's all the time we have for our Safety and Industrial Hygiene panel. Rick and Dan, thank you so much. We've really enjoyed it. Let's give our panelists a big round of applause. We really enjoyed it. Great job.